So I mentioned the term semantic HTML a couple of times in this section. And so let's now actually very quickly define what I actually mean by semantic HTML. So in HTML, when we talk about semantics, what we mean is that certain elements have actually a meaning or a purpose attached to them. So when we think about a certain HTML element, we should actually not think about what that element look like and it's rendered on the page. But instead, we should think about what the element actually means and what it stands for. So that is basically the definition of semantic HTML. Now, not all elements in HTML are semantic. And actually, I talked a little bit about that before here. In this element, so the strong element which makes our element look bold here on the page. So remember how previously I used the B element which simply tells its content full, but doesn't attach it any meaning, right? So I explained that before, and so now maybe it makes a bit more sense. So again, by using the strong element here, the text will look bold here in the browser. But what really matters here is that we now assign some meaning to this content here. We now say that it's going strong element, which means basically a very important piece of content. And the same here for the piece of the fundamental word here. So again we use em for emphasizing this. And so it still looks italic here on the web page. But what we really mean is that we emphasize this word here. So we give it special emphasis. And yeah, that's what this element here right now means. Okay. And the same is actually true for all the elements that we used in the last video. So for example here, the navigation element, all this does is to create a box. Remember which then contains these four anchor elements, but visually it doesn't really do anything. All this does is to represent as a meaning, and this is a navigation. But instead of using nav, we should also use a more generic element, which is the div element. So for example, and as I said earlier, instead of nav here we can just use a div element, but it does not really change anything visually, but it's just creating a box and it generally doesn't have any meaning, but we simply just created a box with this block, challenges, flags, and CSS screen. So back in the day, before HTML5, we always used divs for every single box that we needed like this on the page. But then HTML5 came around and introduced this concept of semantic HTML. And so now we should only use the div element when we don't want to attach a certain meaning to a certain container. So to a certain like box element on our page. So in this case, we really want this to mean this is a navigation. So we use a navigation element for that. Okay. So let's just put that into nav. Okay. And the same is true for the article, the header, the footer that we have down here. And in fact, it is true even for the paragraphs. For example, because all that this paragraph here and all the other paragraphs really are essential, box filled with text. Now the P, of course, does have semantic meaning. It means that it is a paragraph. But we should again use a generic box without any meaning. Instead of P here, we can just put a div. It doesn't change any visually, but here we lost some white spaces. So let's just put it back here to the P. And let's just give it a save. And then just we try to reload the page. And here it is again. But the idea that I mentioned still holds because we could very easily recreate the spaces here using some CSS later. So if we wanted, we could in fact build the entire web page only out of div elements if we wanted and then use CSS to style them as we want. But of course we don't do that. We use semantic HTML to give our elements meaning. Now, you might ask why we actually do that, and there are multiple reasons, and I think I mentioned them already actually. So one of them is search engine optimization, which basically means that search engines such as Google will be able to understand the structure of your content and therefore they will be better able to analyze what your content and what your web page is all about. Also, writing semantic HTML is extremely important for accessibility and especially for people who rely on screen readers to consume our web pages. Okay, so I hope that this makes sense, and we will also keep touching on the subject as we go through the rest of the course. But I still wanted to make it very clear from the very beginning that when we think about HTML, we should not only think about it is actually look like in the browser, but even more what these elements actually mean and what they stand for. And what it being said, we kind of finished all we had to learn in this section. And so in this next section, we will configure VS Code a little bit more and then we will move on to two final challenges in this section. So don't wait and let's move on to the next lecture here.